Okay, so let me introduce you. And we're very happy to have Harris Eisenhardt on our ECOS board as one of our more young and energetic board of directors. He serves as the VP of Outreach, and in that role, he's done a great job with forging connections and collaborations with other groups for ECOS. And he has also spearheaded ECOS's part in the Schenectady Nature Bus these past 2 summers. Harris is an electric market design specialist with a New York independent system operator. He has a BS in sustainable energy management from SUNY ESF and an MS in energy policy and climate from Johns Hopkins. So he's going to tell us about connections between homelessness and climate change. All right, thanks, Harris.
Wow, I was not expecting that. Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate the introduction.
Oh, one thing I forgot was to make you a co-host so that you can share your screen. Hold on. More. Chat, rename. Josh, are you right there?
Yeah, I can do it if you want.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is my first of the season and I have to relearn it every beginning of every season. There we go.
Okay, looks like I should be able to now. Let's see.
There you go. I'll make both your phone and your computer.
Thank you. Let's see. So there should be a slide. Let me know if that looks. How does that look? Can we see that?
Yes.
Okay. And do you see the slide or do you see all of PowerPoint? I've got 2 screens, so I'm not sure which one you see.
It's not.
Yeah, we see the PowerPoint itself, not the slideshow.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, good. All right. All right. Just in time, the dog starts barking. All right, let's get started. So first of all, again, thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. I really appreciate that. Yeah, so my name's Harris Eisenhardt. I've been with ECOS for a couple years now. I've been on the board in the outreach role for that time, and I've enjoyed every second of it. And I've attended a couple of these talks, so I'm really happy to finally come around and be able to offer something tonight. So as Sarah mentioned, the talk is about climate change and unhoused or homeless populations. So what I'm going to dig into is specifically this idea of vulnerability to climate change. This is a concept that I think we all inherently know about and we all experience, but don't often engage with very deeply. So my hope tonight is that we can have a conversation about it, and specifically this area of homelessness and those who are experiencing living without a home. It's a completely different life and a completely different struggle with climate change. And so my hope is that I'll highlight some of that and then talk about the research framework that we put together as part of my degree, and some of the steps we can all take just to think and engage with this a little bit more on a regular basis. So let's see, switch this. Okay, so yeah, just to summarize, again, this was from a master's degree, so the focus was really climate adaptation. And so to drill down a bit more within the realm of climate adaptation, I wanted to look at vulnerability specifically. And I thought to myself, arguably, what is the most vulnerable population in society, at least in the United States? And, I make the argument that is the unhoused population. So what this is going to do, first thing we're going to do is attempt to describe why it's unique and why it's so disproportionate vulnerability of unhoused individuals to climate change in the US. We're also going to take a look at the practice of vulnerability assessment broadly. What does that mean? And then also in the unhoused context, how is it different? And then lastly, proposing the framework that came out of this research that helps us measure climate vulnerability. And then ultimately the goal with that is that it supports broader data collection and can help strengthen some of the policies that go in for climate adaptation in the near future. So I wanted to start with this quote. This was one of the key resources that I used as part of the research. It was a report, it's called the All In report from the US Interagency Council on Homelessness. It came out 2 years ago. And the quote is, "It does not have to be this way. Homelessness is not inevitable, and it is not unsolvable. We envision a future in which no one experiences homelessness, not even for one night." So I wanted to start with that just because I think homelessness and those who experience living without a house or reliable shelter, that's a topic that it can be very polarizing. It can be very political in our society, and I think it's important to level set with, it's really what it comes down to is human health and human lives and human well-being, and we're all humans, and so I think one of the adjacent goals of this research is to really highlight, when we think about climate policy, we need to make sure that we're not painting with too broad of a brush, especially when it comes to vulnerability, because it's very disproportionate. And I thought that quote really captured the sentiment that I want to get and I want to capture. So I also included another quote from the same report. "So as our nation faces the growing threats of climate change, more Americans are being displaced from their homes, and people experiencing unsheltered homelessness face even greater risk to their health and safety as a result of climate-related crises like wildfires, floods, and hurricanes." So 2 things to take away from this. First of all, it's being acknowledged on the federal level, right? The recognition that there is an explicit relationship and direct impacts between those who are unhoused and climate change. And the other thing to take away too, so first of all, that it's being recognized, but secondly, that there's a couple angles to think about this, right? So in this particular quote that I pulled, there's 2 dimensions, right? So people who are unhoused already and are then experiencing climate change to a greater or worse degree than those who have shelter. And the second dimension is that climate change can oftentimes be the reason for someone becoming unhoused. So there's really 2 angles to this story. I will say that the research focuses more on the former point that I made. So for those who are unhoused, what is the experience with climate change and how is that disproportionate to compared to those who have shelter? The graphic here as well is directly from that report. Again, I highly recommend checking it out. So this is just some figures, right? Just to level set, 1.25 million people experiencing sheltered homelessness at some point in 2020. The figure on the far right, though, to me is far more striking. And that's, over 500,000 people experienced homelessness on just a single night in January of 2022. And then also the report notes that is an increase from the previous measurement. So it's the prevalence of homelessness, it's increasing in the United States, and it is something that's being measured diligently. A lot of times it's specific to cities and municipalities that do it, but this report on a federal level is a great resource to get a snapshot of how things look. So again, we're focusing on how climate change impacts people who are unhoused, and that's that specific additional dimension to this, right? I would venture a guess that most of the people listening are, willing to recognize climate change as a reality, and it's something that we have to reckon with and have been as a society. But again, thinking about it in terms of, specifically for people who don't have shelter on a regular basis, that's what I want to highlight with this. So a couple statistics here to kind of paint the picture, and I'll just read these out. These are just some of the ways that climate change manifests in the United States. There's, we can think about it in several different contexts, but at least in these kind of popular, like you think about climate change, you think about extreme heat, air quality, right? So this first quote, 1/3 of heat-related deaths in Maricopa County, Arizona, from 2006 to 2016, so a decade of data, 1/3 were unsheltered individuals. From the same line there on heat, there are estimates that suggest that those who are unhoused are 200 times more likely to succumb to heat-related illness than sheltered individuals. On the air quality front, there was a study in Salt Lake County in Utah that found that essentially 90% of the individuals who were interviewed from the unhoused population reported seeking medical attention for issues related to poor air quality. And then lastly, this one is I want to call attention to this because when we think of climate change, a lot of times the notion of extreme winters falls out of the conversation. But we have to remember that this is still a dimension of climate dynamics that we can't ignore, particularly in vulnerability assessments. So on that front, there was some research done in New York City for, again, about a decade that found that 24% of all hypothermia-related hospitalizations and then 18% of the resultant deaths were unhoused individuals. And like I said, there's many different impacts from climate change, but these are just a few I wanted to call attention to. The same is true and the same is observed in the research we did in extreme precipitation, drought, and flooding as well. So I threw a lot of information already at you. I want to stop and just pause and ask everybody to think about this for a second. So when you experience climate and when you experience climate impacts, think about a couple questions just to ask yourselves, and no one has to answer them out loud, but just something to keep in the back of your head as we walk through this. So, I put a couple examples up there. Extreme heat, it's raining very hard, it's flooding in your neighborhood, there's a wildfire, the air quality is poor. How do you manage that for yourself? Think about what actions you take to, whether it's avoid it or mitigate it or lessen the impact. How did you find out that this was happening, right? Is this something that you heard about from a resource that was reporting to you? Is it something that you noticed yourself? And then more broadly speaking, what enabled you to stay inside, for example, and avoid the extreme heat? Think about your life, what you have access to. What are the resources that you have at your disposal that essentially makes this a non-issue? So like I mentioned up front, putting these two topics side by side, they're hard conversations to have, right? Most folks either don't want to engage or are very set in terms of how they think about homelessness or how they think about climate change, whether it's due to political reasons or due to their own lived experience and the bias from that. But if we put all of that aside, something that's, I would argue, objectively true is that people who don't have permanent, accessible, and sovereign, what I mean is being able to make the choice to use shelter yourself, face the effects of climate change first and the worst. So I also want to define a couple terms too that I've been using. So unsheltered homelessness versus sheltered homelessness, really the distinction there is that think about how the person is generally spending nights. There are people who experience homelessness who have access to shelters and facilities like that and can spend nights there and have access to those resources, and others who don't. And so that population is considered unsheltered. So those folks are, for example, spending nights in public spaces that are not intended for human habitation, like sidewalks, subways, vehicles. And I put that word sovereign in there again. And really, it comes down to the choice and the ability to take action yourself and have control over your ability to find shelter and remove yourself from conditions that may cause harm. And again, tying that into really climate change and how those types of conditions are only exacerbated. So vulnerability, climate vulnerability, I don't know how familiar folks are with this. We think about vulnerability, it's generally we all have an idea of what it means, but there's a study, there is a field behind it in the context of climate change. And so it can be boiled down to an equation. It's a function of three things. It's exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So we can think about vulnerability in any system. But for example, when we think about exposure in the context of climate change, as it says here, that's really the degree of stress or changes in magnitude or frequency, right? So exposure is, to me, I like to think of it as the question, like, number one, is there going to be extreme heat in a given system, in a given census tract, for example? The second component is sensitivity, and that's where we start to think about whether it's people or animals or systems that are actually impacted by that exposure, and to what degree are they impacted. So in at least in this research that we did, we think about sensitivity in terms of people, right? So for someone who has a pre-existing medical condition, or there's a language barrier, or they don't have access to air conditioning, those are just some examples of conditions that would make someone more sensitive to whatever the exposure is in that system. And then the third component is adaptive capacity. And so that, again, pretty self-explanatory, but in this context, what we mean by that is it's the ability to make a change, and it's the ability to adjust and lessen the degree of impact, right? So you can see here mathematically what that's doing here. So the exposure and the sensitivity are these two additive pieces. Sometimes you see them multiplied depending on how it's portrayed. And then the adaptive capacity is subtracting. So if we think about, yes, there's extreme heat. Yes, we have a very sensitive population. However, that population has access to and regularly uses a cooling center. So therefore, some of the impacts of that extreme heat and that inherent sensitivity are mitigated. So when we think about a population that's unhoused, each of these components, we have to look at it through a very different lens. A lot of it comes down to access, and a lot of it comes down to generally what is the experience of living outside full time, or at least most of the time. So for exposure, we're talking about the frequency or the intensity or the spatial distribution or the duration of those storms, flooding events, heat waves, right? On sensitivity, when we think about an unhoused population, it's limited resource access. It might be more prevalent pre-existing health conditions. It might be mobility challenges, whether that's access to transportation or physical mobility challenges, and then economic barriers as well. Adaptive capacity, it's important to recognize here too, when we talk about an unhoused population, this is oftentimes a group of individuals that are really whatever the community or municipality has put in place to assist is the extent to which those individuals have adaptive capacity to climate change. So we'll get into some of the details later on, but what I mean by that is, thinking back to our thought exercise, like a lot of times folks who don't have a home to go back to or air conditioning, right, aren't able to take that sovereign action to reduce the impacts of climate change. And furthermore, too, what we found is that, we all might, for example, if there's flooding that's coming to the area, there's warning systems on our iPhones that tell us, days in advance, or emails, or, whatever it might be. Think about those basic components we have access to that someone who may not have a cell phone or may not have internet access would never hear about otherwise. And then lastly, too, evacuation and response planning. This picture is from a flood that happened of an encampment where unhoused folks were living. And it happened out west. I forget exactly where it was, but basically the story was that this happened, and the town's evacuation and response unit that responds to flooding events and helps people get out of their homes, get to higher ground, get to safety, had no idea that it happened and couldn't actually get to this site for several additional days because of the flooding, right? So this was something that wasn't thought of in advance, wasn't planned for, was not prepared for. And again, we're talking about folks who are living in, as you can see, it might be a tent, it might be, simply sleeping outside. So this is just something that kind of illustrates all of this in one picture. So the research itself, it really, what I wanted to do with this project was say, okay, we know that we don't have a lot of data. We don't really have any data other than anecdotal data to track and analyze the impacts of climate change on unhoused populations broadly. So that's the first point. What's the impact of that? When we make policy decisions in our communities on how to prepare for climate change or how to adapt to climate change, a lot of times the unhoused populations are left out of that conversation, or again, painted with a broad brush. So we don't have a great understanding of the magnitude or the uniqueness of that challenge. So, and this is a lot of words on the bottom here, but in a nutshell, what we wanted to do is put together an assessment methodology. So we didn't look at any real data or communities. What we said is, let's build a tool. Let's build essentially like a step-by-step guide that a community can use to measure the exposure, the sensitivity, and the adaptive capacity components, and essentially describe how vulnerable and in what ways is the unhoused population vulnerable to climate change. And so through those results, through that quantitative data that we otherwise don't have, then we can start to have more informed conversations on how to mitigate it and how to improve resilience. So this is what it looks like. Again, this is just showing the same equation that we looked at earlier, vulnerability, and kind of what's the need for this in the first place. And I got into that a little bit on the last slide, but we have a severe lack of data about unhoused populations and climate change, and that specifically that dynamic. And so let's put together a way to measure that. So that's what we did. So the methodology here, we started with a literature review, and we ended up trying to define, starting from the ground up, we want to talk about how does a community identify climate impacts or climate impact drivers? So what are the specific forces that unhoused populations are dealing with? And that's going to be regionally specific, right? So for example, here in in Albany or Troy or further upstate, we're not thinking about sea level rise and sea level flooding necessarily as much as someone who lives on the coast of New Jersey, for example. So climate impact drivers, first of all, let's figure out what's the pool, what are the potential impacts that we should be documenting. Sorry for the switching. Zoom is trying to do it automatically, so I'll just keep switching back. And then secondly, so we talked about exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity. How do we define those uniquely when we think about unhoused populations? So here, the graphic that you see on the slide is exactly that. So what did we say? First and foremost, lived experience has to be considered in each of these dimensions of the vulnerability equation, right? So if we don't have engagement and information directly from people who are experiencing both living unhoused and also climate change, how are we going to produce anything that's useful, right? So that's the first aspect that you can see that went into each of those. The second bullet on each box is, and this is the bottom box, is it's different depending on what we're thinking about. So for exposure, we're talking about climate modeling, and we're talking about downscaled climate modeling. So what does that mean? So climate modeling is generally done at a granularity of very big systems that are very large, oceanic. We look at a map, we think about climate change. A lot of times it's a global context. Downscaling takes that information and boils it down and makes estimates, model-based estimates of how does that look in Albany? How does that look in Troy? We know the trend of extreme heat across the Northeast, for example, but let's downscale that to this community. So that's the first piece, the exposure piece. Sensitivity, we did a survey of the literature and found that there are plenty of good establish ways to measure sensitivity of a population. So we took those social indicators of sensitivity and we adapted those as well to the unhoused experience. And then the last one, programmatic efficacy for adaptive capacity. So that, again, I mentioned earlier, an unhoused population, if there is not a community cooling center, or if there is not a response program that is specifically going to help people who are unhoused, that's where it ends, right? Folks who are unhoused are not necessarily going to have access to resources to get to those things or put them together, right? So if the community hasn't done it, or if they have done it, but they've done it poorly, then that's a direct impact on the adaptive capacity of the unhoused population. I'm going to take a quick pause. I'm just going to have to get something from my dog she's chewing on. Okay, thank you. So going from that, this is the process flow that we used in this research. So I just kind of walked through this, so I won't spend too much time on this slide. But what I do want to highlight here is that, okay, so we have all this information that I've been throwing at you about exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity. How do we put it all together? How do we normalize it? And the way that we did that is through a system of indicators and ratings. So we said, let's set up buckets, let's set up categories, and let's set up essentially classes that we can use to describe how much exposure, how sensitive, how much adaptive capacity. And we can use those to translate, the lived experience, the information I mentioned earlier that's oftentimes qualitative, into quantitative data. And so again, we can actually use this and say, hey, this community is X, for example, numerical value vulnerable in terms of climate change in the unhoused population. So again, the first point was the climate impact drivers. So what we're recommending through this framework is, you have to decide as a community what's in scope. Like I said, that's going to be geographically different depending on where you are. But how can a community do that? And that's going to come down to geographic information, just intuition, right? A lot of time, like for example, the Southwest or Arizona, for example, right? Extreme cold, probably not going to be thinking about it. Local written or oral history, right? What do people recognize? What do people seem to remember as a problem, right? That is a climate impact that they're suffering from. And so we picked a couple that we just put into the framework as options to sort of get it started. But this list that you see here, it can be adapted completely to the nature of the community. So tying this all together, how does it look? So exposure, we're talking about, again, what are the explicit climate impacts that are happening in this community or in this, for example, census tract? And what we did with the tool or with the methodology is recommend some existing public data sets that allows you to essentially log on and pick a census tract that you want to focus on, and from those resources collect essentially a magnitude of the risk of a given impact. So I mentioned a couple on the last slide. For example, if you go into the models that we recommend here, so for example, the Columbia Climate School Natural Hazards Index 2.0, you can go in there and you can actually look and say, all right, extreme heat in this particular census tract, how much of a problem is it? How much of a risk is it? So the idea is, for using that information, someone who's going to put this together can say, all right, well, we recognize based on this model that extreme heat is X degree a problem, right? So taking that information, the idea is we then have those indicators I talked about and the rating system. So take this observation that we're going to have extreme heat, we have extreme heat, and then identify the rating class, right? So let's say, for example, it's very high. There's a high risk of extreme heat. That gets a number assigned to it. So if we're stepping through this table right here, let's say we pick very high, the rating value that you would assign as part of this method is 1. If it's very low, it would be 0, and so forth. And so that's the model-based component of exposure. Again, I want to stress the lived experience has to be included in each of these. So the way that we captured lived experience across exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity is we recommended that a community conduct a survey. And that is, it's tough coming at it from this lens and this angle. It's a thesis, it's academic, it's not grounded in, it hasn't been tried and tested yet. But something that communities do, and is a common practice, is what's called a point-in-time count. And what that is essentially is an authority, such as the town, would go out for one night and count the number of people that are experiencing homelessness on that night. And that is one of the common ways that the number of people who are homeless, that's how it's identified. Which we can talk about how effective that is. Are there better ways to do it? But the point I'm trying to make is that's an opportunity for people to interface with folks who are unhoused or experiencing living without a home. And there's other opportunities to do it too. Community services, any point at which people are interacting, these questions can be asked. And so that's a point of this research that needs a lot more work, of course. But the idea, at the end of the day, is that we have direct lived experience and input from people who are unhoused in that area. And so here in exposure, we're saying, okay, well, these are the questions that you need to be asking for whatever you're talking about. If it's heat, if it's heavy rain, if it's flooding, hey, to what extent does heat impact you? If the answer is not that much, then there's a lower rating value that goes into the ultimate calculation that we're going to talk about. But if it's every day, I'm struggling with it all the time, people all around me are suffering from it, very high, then we have a higher rating value that goes into ultimately the equation that we use to measure this. And so we do both the current and the predictive sides of this, right? So we have a model that's used for present day. What's the risk? What's the degree of extreme heat? And then we also have a model that we recommend for future. So for example, is that model telling us that we're going to see an increase in the number of days that are extremely hot? If the answer is yes, you get a value. If it's no, you get a value. And then again, on the lived experience front, on the bottom table, how concerned would you be if heat is expected to increase or extreme heat is expected to increase in the future? So again, this is what you can see here. We're highlighting one can't operate without the other. We can have all sorts of modeled information, but if we don't talk to people and get an understanding of their experience with heat, there's a massive gap in what we're trying to do. So that's the exposure component. The sensitivity component is different. And really what I said earlier is that we took a look and we said, all right, there's several well-established lists of indicators that say, these are generally what people use to measure how sensitive a population is. And that's a broad term, right? So in this study, we're talking about how sensitive is an unhoused population to climate change. So we use a couple categories, sociodemographic, infrastructure, health, economic activity, mobility, some of these points I've raised already, and just some examples that you can see. So English as a second language, right? Folks who may not speak English or it's a second language. For example, warnings about flooding, warnings about extreme heat may go completely unnoticed or unrecognized for that reason, right? So that's an example of why that individual would be more sensitive than someone else who does speak English. For example, pre-existing medical conditions, like we talked about, someone who might already suffer from, is prone to dehydration or, for example, that would be someone who is more sensitive to extreme heat or to poor air quality, asthma, right? A common example. And then, so the list goes on, right? Another one to point out is owning a cell phone. something that we all take for granted. But again, that's how we find out about what's coming. Is there an alert for flooding? Don't drive on the roads, stay inside, right? So how does this translate into the indicators and getting some numbers out of it like we just talked about? So what we're doing is, first of all, what's the indicator? So the example I have on the bottom is the shelter type. Okay, so we have that indicator of sensitivity. Now what we do is we infer classes or values for that indicator. So it could be yes, no, like do you have a cell phone or not? Or it could be a little bit more in depth, like the example here. What kind of shelter does this person have access to? Is it a vehicle or a secure waterproof space? Again, we're talking about the realm of someone who's unhoused. Is it a tent or assembled materials? Like we're talking about, whether it's, items that have been constructed into a tent, or is it open air or public outdoor space, right? Essentially no shelter. And so you can see here, and I want folks to just definitely recognize here how this ends up translating into the numbers. If you're in a vehicle or a secure waterproof space, again, it's an unhoused experience. However, that is arguably someone who is less sensitive than someone who is sleeping in a park, for example. So you can see, thinking about it now mathematically, 0.33, right, is a lesser contribution to the overall sensitivity metric than 1.0, right? So if we add up all these values, we get ultimately I won't call it a score, it's really a rating, a measure of sensitivity. And what we're doing or attempting to do is translate this qualitative, this information into numbers, into something that's empirical that we can talk about. So lastly is adaptive capacity. And this one, again, if you think back to the equation, now we're talking about the subtraction, right? So what can be done or what's available that reduces the risk and reduces the sensitivity and exposure to climate impacts. So again, sticking with the example of heat, we thought about this in two lenses. So the first one is programmatic. Think about Schenectady, Niskayuna, wherever you live. What does that community have in place that is available to the unhoused population to deal with this climate impact? So the classic example here is a cooling center, right? For extreme heat, right? There's the other dimension to this too, which we captured with this indicator, which is, towns will often publish, climate adaptation or climate visions or vulnerability reports or assessments. And what this is encouraging someone to do is look at that information and see if you did a control F or you search for the term unhoused or homeless or vulnerable, person, are they mentioned at all, right? Are they mentioned in the guidance or the policies with respect to emergency response or disaster planning? Are they mentioned in public guidance for, how to educate people about heat? These are just some examples, right? But the idea is look at the program structure in this community. To what extent are unhoused individuals included, right? And so again, from here, we're inferring rating classes, moving over a column. Are they mentioned a little bit? Not at all? Well-defined and well-detailed? And then you have a number that comes out of that. And I can say from staring at a lot of this type of documentation across communities all over the country, there is a spectrum. There are some towns and cities that have really taken it upon themselves to recognize that the unhoused experience is, again, the first and the worst in the context of climate change. So they've put together information that is useful and is recognizing that, that is a priority population to assist in these times of climate impacts. There are others where it is completely missing. So that, something for folks to take away to go do is look at your town's climate change guidance and emergency planning and preparedness. Ask this question, right? Are unhoused people mentioned? Are they well-defined at all? And then again, for the third time, lived experience, right? Can't stress that enough. So we might have a cooling center in Schenectady. This is just me, an example. I don't know for sure, but we might have a cooling center. If someone who's unhoused doesn't know about it or doesn't feel that it's actually useful for whatever reason, then that has a direct bearing on how vulnerable that person is to extreme heat. So it might be there, but if folks aren't using it or can't access it for whatever reason, we want to know that. We want to capture that. And so that's what that second flavor of indicator is attempting to do. So this is just summing it all up, putting it all together. What is a town or a municipality going to do to actually calculate what we termed the unhoused climate vulnerability index? And that is the number that comes out of all of this information we've been talking about. So this is much simpler than it looks. Basically, it says you're going to calculate this value for a given census tract. And the way that you'll do that is measuring the exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity for each person in that census tract. And you're summing it up and calculating an average of all the individuals in that particular tract. And then it's just the basic math that comes with that. So you're adding the exposure and the sensitivity, and then you're subtracting the adaptive capacity. And what that gives you is a number. It is a number that, as of today, because we have no real data that's actually been applied to this yet, means nothing. It's entirely subjective. But the idea, as I mentioned, is that as this, and the vision is that as this becomes commonplace and is used and is adopted by communities, we have a metric that we can compare and we can track over time. So hypothetically, how does this look, right? How can we illustrate this? So let's say we had hypothetical census tract A. There's two people there who are unhoused, and there are two impacts of climate change that we recognize as a result of the pre-work that we talked about: extreme heat and flooding. So the assessment practitioner in this example uses that point in time count to conduct the surveys that we talked about, asks those questions, uses the models, and the results are on the right. So the top, and these are two, this type of chart is pretty common in vulnerability assessments and how people illustrate the results. So you can see we have different results for heat and flooding. And what this tells us is the degree of which component of vulnerability, right? So if we look at, let's use heat first, the blue, you can see that the exposure, or the unhoused climate exposure index up at the top, is nearly 1, a score of 1. And if we look at the adaptive capacity of the blue triangle, it's very low relatively. So what you can infer from that is that the population is highly exposed to heat, but has, I would call, extremely low adaptive capacity to heat. And then we see, again, for example, the flooding, which is the orange, is a little more evenly distributed. But what this tells us very quickly is, exactly what I just mentioned, right? We know that, for example, maybe a population is very well adapted and has strong adaptive capacity and is generally not very exposed to a given climate impact. This helps us visualize it and communicate that readily. So getting into just the discussion and kind of some takeaways from this, and I'm going to go a little bit quicker through these last couple slides just so that we have a chance for questions. So again, what were we trying to do with this? Take what is oftentimes anecdotal or not measured information about an unhoused population's experience with climate change and translate that to numbers, simply put. So possible use cases that we thought about for this, assess a community level average based on this index value from all the census tracts in a community. So you can map this information. You could compare the vulnerability among different census tracts and use that to prioritize where the intervention should be. Where should we be working first? And then you can use this to establish a baseline. And in future years, do it again, reassess it, What's changed? Has it gotten better? Has it gotten worse since we, for example, implemented the community hydration or cooling center program? Has it worked? Right. Again, key takeaway that this is a collaborative framework and can't function without lived experience and that input. So that's imperative. And as I mentioned earlier, that's an area that it's going to depend on the community, and it certainly warrants more research. And again, calling out some limitations from the research that we did. We didn't have an actual population that we worked with for this. We just demonstrated this hypothetically and put together the method. So what can we do as a group? The first thing I want to say is have those conversations, start the dialogue, right? Ask ourselves, our families, our friends, workplaces, what can we do to improve how our communities approach disaster preparedness? Because we might think about extreme heat or flooding only when we get that ping on our phone. But the days where it's just consistently 85, for example, if we think about not having air conditioning or having to be outside through all of that, right? That tolerance for what we consider maybe to be a disaster is much lower, arguably, for someone who's unhoused. So think about those things that we have access to and we have at our disposal to deal with these impacts of climate change, and recognize if we build our programs and we build our climate adaptation on this kind of logic and this ethos of, oh, well, we have air conditioning, we have this, right? We're going to forget people, and we're going to forget unhoused people in particular. Again, and we'll share the slides too, so I won't read everything here, but there are places today where we feel that this can have an immediate impact in what's going on, right? So, for example, we talked about Maricopa County earlier, and there's a heat relief network of cooling centers and intervention services that, if you look it up, have reported to serve nearly 30,000 people in a single location. We might use this methodology to actually assess, are we reaching the full extent of the unhoused population? Are we reaching anyone who is unhoused, right? If we're not, why? Another example would be in Chicago, there's, public data about those point-in-time counts that I mentioned, which talk about the number of unhoused and unsheltered individuals in the city. And if you look, and again, I'm talking about what's available in the reports and the documentation today. If you look at the climate action plan, the term homeless appears just in relation to extreme winter conditions, right? So the city might take this, run with it, and conduct the assessment for a whole slew of climate impacts and realize we've been thinking about winter and extreme cold, but we're completely forgetting about extreme heat, or we're completely forgetting about air quality. And that's what people are suffering from more. And that's what we should be working on first. So again, what can we do? Use this information to improve what we have. So just to call this out, I've kind of alluded to this a couple times because this example, I think, speaks volumes, right? There's an article out from Los Angeles that basically says, interviews several people who are unhoused there and says, yeah, there are cooling centers, but I cannot afford the bus ticket that I need to get there. It's a long walk, and I don't want to do that in the extreme heat, right? So on paper, the cooling center is there. Great. Is it working? No. And how would we know that without engaging in that conversation? And how can we translate that information beyond just an article in a news outlet and say, here's the numbers, right? Here's the information from this methodology that describes this experience. And then I mentioned that picture early on. So this is just a description from what that was in 2021, right? So there are dedicated, staff there. The Union Station Homeless Services were unable to reach an encampment of unsheltered individuals during a flood, isolating them from essential services like evacuation, medication, food and water, generally just rescue, right? Again, are folks who are unhoused included in those warning systems, those evacuation plans? This is what happens if not. And then lastly, just again, this is the article. It's open access, so you don't have to pay for it. It's out there, and we're trying to speak about it wherever we can and get people to engage with it. But that's just another resource for you to have. I was going to list out other reading materials and such on the slides, but I figured just put the article here, and everything is in there in terms of reports that are helpful to get more context about the situation and what's going on, and just more details about this methodology overall. So I just wanted to point to that as well, and where that can be found. And then the key takeaways, which I think we've covered them in pretty good depth right now. The last thing I'll say is just for future research. I said this is going to be pretty specific to each given community. So think about how we can standardize this and expand it more broadly, because more data is always better, especially than what we have now. And then also, consider how can we adapt this and make it more accessible, so this can be picked up and communities can run with this. And if it looks different from one town to the next, but they're still sharing this important information, then that's great. That's still results. And so again, this article was really focused on the US and the frameworks we have here. But again, the homelessness is not just a United States issue, of course, right? So the other recommendation there was, think about this in other countries as well. So that was it. I hope we can stay past 8, because I definitely want to talk about it and see if there's questions. But I put some emails there too, and then also just a plug that don't forget to sign up for the Rachel Carson dinner. But that was it. So happy to take questions, and thank you again for letting me talk at you for an hour.
That was fantastic. Really interesting, Harris. Let's let everybody unmute themselves, and we have a small group, so feel free to just leave yourself unmuted if that works.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you stop sharing screen, maybe we can all see each other.
Yeah, let's see.
Have a discussion.
Let's
I
see
put it
here.
on in the comment there, Harris. Can you email around the link to the paper
Yep, absolutely.
or post whatever?
Sure thing. I can do that. There's everybody.
So Janet, I think I saw you.
Yeah, I have a question. It's at the beginning, Harris, you talked about the fact that climate change is also a cause of losing your home, not having a home temporarily or for a long time. And so I was thinking about how there may be two groups of people who could also benefit from having some kind of a location that is set aside for events like heat, in addition to the people who are living outside. Obviously, they need people's attention, but you kind of alluded to this, the fact that not everybody has air conditioning, and there are probably a lot of people who could benefit from a cooling center. I know they often open them up to people who need them, but cooling centers could benefit people who are just simply unable to adapt to the situation in their homes, who also have homes, but could benefit from need the cooling station as well. And then also we have many kinds of situations, natural disasters and things like that, where people lose their home, are flooded out, for example, or they lose power during a time when they can't, when they need it for safety. And so is that also a model that is the idea, to have a place that's set aside for situations when people need housing and don't have it where they are?
Yeah, that's a lot of great points, Janet. I think, so like I said, I think the first thing people think of in terms of climate change and homelessness is like a wildfire or a flood displaces, an entire block or an entire neighborhood. And that's, folks who need somewhere to go at that point, right? So that is something that we didn't dig into too much in this particular model. But to your point, as a result of a community thinking about, and it isn't just unhoused people, like you said, who are suffering from climate change, of course, disproportionately, but like if a community puts in a cooling center or a warming center or, whatever it might be, there's no reason to limit that or have it be a very specific targeted group, right? It's a co-benefit if it's intended to help one group, but ultimately is for the community. So we didn't dig into that too much in this model, but it's definitely something that is talked about quite a bit.
Thank you so much for that, Harris. It was an excellent presentation. I was, as you were talking, looking at the Schenectady Climate Vulnerability and Adaptation Plan and trying to get a little bit of a sense for the extent to which we are looking at these needs in the area, and wondered if anyone had any insights into how well Schenectady is currently adapting for the needs of the unhoused population and where there's more need for advocacy in that area.
Yeah, I'd be curious. I know a couple people here who definitely have a pulse on that, I'm sure, but at least from my perspective, I don't think it's gold standard by any stretch. I think there's plenty of opportunity to improve there. And that's true pretty much most places. Like I mentioned earlier, there were a couple highlights looking through this, like Los Angeles was one, certain like Phoenix, Arizona, another where they really are reckoning with it and thinking about it and writing it down. But most communities, not really. But again, I'm sure others here, would know what's going on in Schenectady on that front.
Harris, did your literature review include any European countries, especially some of the more Scandinavian ones? Or did you pretty much?
No, that's a great point though, because that's what we recognized as we were going through. We said, let's limit the scope to the US to make it doable in a semester. But, quickly realized that this is something that we definitely should, or someone should take it and run with it and look at it. And maybe there is a country, especially in that part of the world, that's doing it well or has it figured out. So we did not, though, unfortunately.
Harris, hi, it's Tom. Thank you for that. Was a great presentation. I'm curious, in your research, do you know if anyone has looked at any of the other potential impacts of climate change on homelessness? And what I'm thinking about is that it seems to me that it's likely to increase homelessness through somebody mentioned disasters, but also climate migration and just higher costs. A lot of there's going to be a direct link, or there is a direct link, I think, between housing costs and homelessness. And climate. So, did you look at that at all?
So we didn't make any attempts to add to that body of research, but there is quite a bit. So that's what I found. There's one resource in particular that is included in the paper. It's cited. I think it's the Homelessness or the Homeless Hub. It's somewhere. I think it's maybe the University of Toronto. It's somewhere in Canada, but they have. There's a couple authors there who have really dug in and thought about, like you said, the more systemic impacts that results from climate change driving communities out of their homes, and what does that do to, like you said, housing costs and local economy and generally infrastructure. So we didn't spend too much time on this, but it is something that we know there is quite a bit of research on that already.
Certainly,
Yeah, I suspect there's a double whammy there too.
Sorry, go ahead, Josh.
Oh, I was gonna say, I suspect there's a double whammy there too with the housing crisis in general,
Yeah.
causing an increase. I'm gonna say it's completely anecdotal, but I spend a lot of time on, urban trail systems, and I'm definitely seeing more people intense than I have in previous years. So I suspect that it's on the rise.
Oh, I
Yeah.
love the qualitative information transferred into quantitative. And, as you're talking, I keep thinking about this fabulous project that Tom is, taking the lead on Seek. And in this building, Seek is our coming environmental center. We will have exhibit space and hopefully, changing exhibits too. And we certainly want to, at some point focus on climate change. And I can imagine using some of your information to get high school kids just for their awareness on how to use a system to get quantitative data and start putting awareness around Schenectady and having some high school students get into applying this model a little bit.
That would be great. Yeah, I've got a poster pre-made, so we can definitely talk about that.
Yeah, thinking about that, Harris, like since your model is really a characterization model, it's not a predictive model.
Yeah.
So you don't need to go through the step of proving it or qualifying it to data. Basically, it is what it is, characterizing reality. So it seems like you could throw that at publicly available data. And really apply that index more broadly, because you know which way which direction of badness and goodness. You may not be able to predict anything. You can characterize relative performance of cities.
Yeah, and so so I am on the Troy Sustainability Task Force here. So I've been looking at the Climate Smart Communities program a lot for New York State, and that's one of the actions that a community can take as part of that is to do a vulnerability assessment. And so I think there especially is an opportunity to at least just one line item, right? Like consider how this is different for the unhoused population in your community. And it doesn't have to be as extensive as the entire model, but at a minimum, just recognizing it, I think, is important. To your point, Josh.
Yeah, get some kids out there to be the assessment practitioners, collecting some data, and that would be fantastic.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, we just heard Joanne, one of the ECOS member at the Carrot Fest, who's teaching a data science class in Niskuna, and it'd be nice to have some real world examples that actually mean something. Yeah. Okay, Colony. Yes.
Hi, Penny. Any other questions?
I'm just wondering if there was talk about capacity, because in many cooling centers and hydration spots, it seems that for these emergent situations where you can't really calculate how many individuals would be afflicted, if the folks who have stable housing, the folks who do not have stable housing, what do the numbers, can they really look like when we're looking at these emergencies?
That is a fantastic point. And I mean, what we learned through this process is that similar to like how we build for the, historically the 100-year flood or the 100-year event, a lot of times adaptation solutions are the same. So let's take the existing, community space that's already here and make that work for what we think we need, right? The number of people who are going to be coming to a cooling center, it's not really thought of in the context of like, let's expand it. Let's think if this was twice as bad, that's what we should be designing for. And so then you see from that, like one of the stats I didn't include there was about precipitation. you know, other than the obvious of like someone who's outside and gets wet, we can throw stuff in the dryer. They can't a lot of times do that. And so that leads to other impacts. But beyond that, places that folks go to take shelter, there's a couple case studies out of the Pacific Northwest where disease transmission picks up like exponentially, particularly in shelters for unhoused people. So yeah, Juliana, yeah, that is a really difficult point to kind of reckon with. Like we need to convince, you know, the folks who are making those decisions to be designing for the next worst case scenario, you know, and not just what we think we know in terms of how many people would be coming or using it. Because like I said, there's no easy way to tell.
Thank you. And perhaps maybe we can come up with those solutions to avoid those emergencies, which is my ultimate point.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the one key theme across all of this was just the element of time and like how much easier it is for a community to, you know, recognize that there's going to be a heat wave and make the necessary preparations than managing the fallout of it afterwards and reaching populations that are, you know, suffering in that moment versus getting out ahead of time and saying, go somewhere there's shade, you know, take the day off, find some water, right? Like here's some water, whatever it is, versus medical responses, basically is what it comes down to. And that was, yeah, across all the impacts that we looked at, that was a key theme.
Any other questions? Comments?
And I'm going to put the link. What do you think, Sarah, in the chat, or should we email it, or what's...
Why don't you put it in chat right now? I'm actually not clear on, I don't think chat shows up in the recorded version, but put it on and people can take a photo, copy and paste, do what you want before we leave the meeting with that information. And actually, I'll copy and paste and see if I can add it later.
That sounds good. Yeah, and also someone commented this, you know, thanks for the sobering presentation. Thank you for listening and just like, you know, I think this is, like I said at the beginning, it's two topics that I would argue are like, you know, people just don't want to talk about, right? Or if they do, they're very set in their ways on how they think about either one. So I would definitely encourage you to, you know, when you do approach this topic, like, you know, take a step back and you can see that we can really boil it down to science that's intended to help people, right? That's it at the end of the day. Doesn't have to be any politics involved. So, but yeah, thank you all for coming and listening.
Yeah, I just have one point. Harris, you said, I think Tom and I may be the only people on this call who live in the city. And you said we know the situation here. Actually, I don't, speaking for myself, I don't know how much thought the city officials have given to this issue. And I wouldn't even know whom to approach to advocate that they start using your methodology to measure this stuff.
I will say they, you know, there's a lot of good effort in the city spent on addressing homelessness. Not that they're, you know, it's an increasing problem, and as Josh said, you know, you see it from the trails, you see it in the parks, and but as far as the climate, the thing Harris referenced, the
Climate smart community.
Yeah, the city's has a terrible record for that, and they've let you know, left a lot of opportunities go. So I wouldn't be too optimistic about them, you know, adopting something as rigorous as this. And I also know there's a few other city residents on the call. So, but yeah, that is a good question, Art, but unfortunately, I'm not, too optimistic about the city, especially on the climate side. The better on on house side, but on the climate side, yeah. And not just the city, I'm sorry, also the whole network. It's largely the network of non-governmental agencies and nonprofits around the city and the county that pick up the slack of this.
The county does have an organization called the Schenectady Environmental Advisory Council that is supposed to make recommendations to the county planning department or something. I mean, they may be, I don't know how active they are. They've got various committees. I was on one, and nothing ever came of it. They never even met, but maybe they should be approached and made aware of this, and maybe they'd take a look at it specifically for the city or the county.
You know any members of the Schenectady Conservation Council?
Yeah, the Environmental Advisory
You're
Council.
talking about the county,
Yeah. Mhm.
Josh?
No, I mean, I was asking a question because I know I've dealt with the Rotterdam and the Schenectady and the Niskuna versions
Yeah.
of the Conservation Advisory Council. I don't
Right.
know anybody on the Schenectady one.
Yeah.
I know a couple of the people involved with them, and I'd be glad to pass that information on to them if that's helpful. Definitely seems like something they should be aware of.
That would be great. Yeah, I appreciate everybody's comments on that too. That's the next step, right? Like I said, we made the template and now we want to use it. So yes, by all means, please share it. Please reach out.
Well, awareness is always the first step, and that's where I'm so excited about Seek, because this is a perfect place where we can exhibit these kind of things and increase awareness and, not have it fly outside of people's radar.
Absolutely.
That was just great. Thank you, Harris.
No, thank you. Thank you, Sarah, for coordinating. And thanks again, everybody, for jumping on. Appreciate it.
And let me add one more thing before people leave. Our next speaker will be Relief and with DEC, and that will be again third Thursday of October, which I think is October 17th. So just keep an eye out for your MailChimps and check out the ECOS website for information, and hopefully see everybody then as well. All right, have a good night.
Thanks again, all.
Good night.
Thank you.